Hi, everybody. This is Saad for the Saad Truth. Today I have a back-to-back evolutionist and biologist. Last week I had Colin Wright, who studied wasps and spiders. Today I've got Menno. Let me pronounce the name properly, Schilthuizen, but please pronounce it the Dutch way.
It was almost perfect. It's the Dutch way would be Schilthuizen.
There you go. We can also talk about how much I loved Johan Cruyff growing up in 1974 in the World Cup. We can talk about that if you'd like later. But I first want to introduce you, uh, tell people how I discovered you. I discovered you, by the way. I'm still reading it. You see, there's still a mark here. I'm still going through it. It's Darwin Comes to Town, How the Urban Jungle Drives Evolution. Phenomenal book. Love it.
Thank
But
you.
some of your earlier books, Frogs, Flies, and then Billions, 2008, The Loom of Life, 2008, Nature's Nether Regions. We want to talk about that, the evolution of genitalia. And
Yeah.
then, as I said, Darwin Comes to Town, and you've got an upcoming book, Urban Naturalist, in
Right.
2025. Anything else we need to cover, Menno, before we get going?
Um, that I think that's a good summary. But besides writing, I'm also an expedition leader. So I also take people into the field to show them the things that I write about. So via Taxon Expeditions, which is our scientific travel agency. If you want to meet the stuff I'm writing about up close, you can have a look there.
And the people who are signing up for those field expeditions, they're not necessarily scientists. They're just lay people
No.
who are interested
Yeah.
in science.
Exactly, science or nature or knowledge in general. Yeah, so we just came back from Tuscany, where we every year we do an expedition around the medieval castle, and there were people from all over the world with from all walks of life, jointly doing a biodiversity inventory and discovering new species, and it's usually a lot of fun.
How does that process of learning or teaching compare to in the classroom? What are some of the key differences between, let's call them the lifelong learners versus the university students?
Well, for me personally, what I notice is that students they're used to sitting in the classroom. They're used to having well-trained scientists telling them about their stuff. So they're a bit blasé. They've seen a lot, they've heard a lot, but when you have people who just come out of their regular jobs and you put them in the field with a couple of passionate scientists, they love it, and they because their infectious enthusiasm makes us fall in love all over again with our own field of research. And that's, to me, I mean, it's great to teach students, and of course some students are like that as well, but with these community scientists, the enthusiasm and the infectiousness of their enthusiasm to back to myself is very rewarding.
Well, one of the things, I mean, we'll dive into this book in a lot more details in a second, but one of the things that I think came out in several of your examples that you were describing is the citizen scientist, right? This is where professional scientists are seeking the help of everyday people to be able to actually collect the necessary data that they need to collect to complete their project. Is this a rather new phenomenon? Is it on the upswing? Is it on the downswing? Tell us a bit about citizen scientists.
Yeah, as you describe it, that is sort of the classical citizen science, which has been going on for a long time actually already, because even from before the Second World War, there were I mean the famous um, project on um, trying to figure out how great tits, which is the
Yeah.
European bird, how they learn to open up milk bottles, which
I
happens.
just finished that section this
Oh,
morning.
you did, huh? Yeah. But and that was studied in a sort of a citizen science way, because the scientists were sending out letters to people, and they were putting ads in the newspaper, and people were asked to send in observations of birds doing this and sort of carrying out this behavior. So that sort of work, trying to get more data by involving the general public, has been going on for quite a long time. It's still on the rise, but in the last 10 years, also in my own work, it's been overtaken by something much more comprehensive, which we call extreme citizen science or community science, where the general public is not just involved in the data gathering part of the research, but they come up with the research questions. They come up with finding a method to study it. And the scientists are just there for guidance, for coming up with some ideas, but really the initiative is with the community scientists. And that's something we've been trying to stimulate over the past few years. That's also something that my new book is largely about, where the scientific process, or the non-professional scientist is involved in the entire scientific process, right from the conception of a question until the publication of the results. And that's even more exciting, I think.
Wow, that I love this stuff. So have there been any studies that have compared the veracity, the methodological rigor, the theoretical sophistication that stems from what you're calling the extreme community scientists or citizen scientists to the standard professional scientists? And if so, what are the results?
Yeah, there's a couple of people working on this. I think Mookie Hackley in University College London has been doing some work on this. I'm not exactly up to date on the results of that, but in general, of course, the rigidity is less, but often this is compensated by the volume of the data that people gather, because the number of data that large groups of people can gather are so large that the enhanced error that you get in data gathered by non-professional scientists sort of is compensated for by the bulk of the data. So you still get a good statistical signal out of it.
Now, you meant to say rigidity as a negative thing. You didn't mispronounce. You meant to say rigor. You meant rigidity, correct?
Oh, sorry, I probably meant rigor. Yes.
Okay. No, because that's what I thought you might have meant. But had you meant rigidity, that actually would segue to something that I was going to say, which is, so I recently did do you know what an X Spaces is on X?
I've heard about it. Yeah, I don't have much experience with it. Yes.
Well, you should, as someone who seems to very much want to connect with the public, I would highly recommend you look into it. So X Spaces basically allows you to, you say, okay, at 7:30 tonight, Eastern time, I'm opening my mic. I'm going to be talking about the evolutionary behavioral sciences. Anybody who wants to come open your mic and just listen, And so right now it's only audio, but I know that Elon Musk is trying to turn it into also a visual means.
Okay.
So I will open it up just impromptu. At 4 o'clock, I decide, you know what? I feel like just lecturing about whatever, evolutionary behavioral sciences.
Okay.
And then, 2,000, 4,000, 8,000 people just show up to hear. Now you could open it up. You can have them ask questions. I find it a bit overwhelming to try to manage the process.
Yeah.
So usually it's a one-way lecture and people listen and then, and now in my latest X Spaces, to the point of rigidity, I was talking about the fact that much of scientific research often misses a key metric, which is interestingness of the research, right? You have the methodological rigor and you have the theoretical sophistication, you have internal and external validity, but the end result, forgive me for saying it, is pure bullshit, right? We find out that consumers who are, satisfied with the restaurant are more likely to return to the restaurant. Well, who would not have thought that? But if you read the paper, it's unbelievably sophisticated and a lot of mathematical symbols and so on, but nobody gives a damn. It's all bullshit. Now,
proving obvious.
Exactly. So my view is that probably the citizen scientists are less rigid and might actually come up with more interesting research questions than the professional scientists. Does that seem to make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. That's certainly true. I can't really come up with an example, but I've noticed the same thing before when you talk to community scientists about some field of research, then they come up with suggestions, some of which don't make sense, but some might make sense that a colleague in the same field would never have come up with, because we're trained to think in a certain framework, and this was just outside of the framework, but it still might help.
Right. You may know this paper, and if you don't, please put it on your roster for your doctoral students. There's a 1971 paper by Davis. It's called "That's Interesting!" And what he basically does is he offers a framework for how to, I mean, yes, there's an element of personal preferences. You may like plant physiology, whereas I'm not interested in this. So there is a personal element, but is there some quantifiable epistemological ways by which we could say this is interesting more so than that?
Mhm.
And to that point, let me give an example in this beautiful book right here, Darwin Comes to Town, of what I would consider that's interesting. The study with the butts of cigarettes,
Yeah.
whereby the people, you know, the well, you tell it. You tell the story.
Yeah, well, it's we I think that the reason that I find that study interesting, and also some other studies that we're doing now with my PhD students, is that we've been trained to think of human pollution as pollution, as something that is bad, that interferes with animals' lives, and it does, but we are not trained to think in the living environment immediately responding to whatever we throw at them. And in this case, this was a study done in Mexico City where house sparrows and house finches were found to have large numbers of discarded cigarette butts in their nests. And it turned out that the cigarette butts usually have a little bit of tobacco left in them. Tobacco contains nicotine. Nicotine is a natural insecticide. And we know from previous work that birds often put green plants in their nests, of which also have insecticide properties, to help reduce. I mean, that behavior has been selected to help reduce the parasitic mites and fleas in their nests. And it turns out that these cigarette butts do the same. So they probably pick up the leftover nicotine that's in the butts. They sense this, and that's why they also incorporate those filter tips in their nest, which we think is just trash. But to them, it's a valuable resource for keeping their parasite levels in their nests down. And that's something that I notice a lot of people find hard to get their heads around. That's something that we are primed to see as trash, as something bad. We've been trained to see it as negative because it's our waste that we burden the rest of nature with. The rest of nature doesn't care what we feel. They'll use it if they can, and that doesn't matter to them whether it's human waste or natural waste. And we've now been studying the use of a student of mine, Auke Florian Hiemstra. He's studying the use of plastic waste by birds in their nests also, and we're also seeing some tantalizing indications that some birds actually prefer to put plastic in their nest. Possibly, we don't know exactly if that's true yet, but possibly because they appreciate the same properties that we do in plastic. It's durable, doesn't get waterlogged, it's strong. So what that also means, and I think that is also the interesting part. Sorry if I'm going on too long, but that as soon as we interfere with the environment, it's changed forever. And that's also why cleanup projects, if you do them too long after the fact, you're already interfering with an environment that has started to adapt to
Right.
whatever we're trying to clean up.
Yeah, yeah. So to go back to that's interesting paper, there are multiple levels of interestingness in that study. So first, that nicotine, you know, in the cigarettes are linked to the amount of parasitic mites in the nest. That's the variable A and B that I wouldn't have thought should be related and are related. That's interesting. Number two, to your point, I meaning general person, I'm thinking that in all circumstances, litter bad. Now I find out litter good. That's interesting. So I can start taking all of the framework of that Davis 1971 paper. I think he's got 12 criteria. And I can show that on at least 2, 3, 4 of these, it's ticking it off. So what a wonderful way to teach students how to not just do methodologically rigorous. And now, by the way, it doesn't have for it to be interesting, doesn't have to be counterintuitive always, but it certainly has to make you say, Oh, wow. I didn't know that. If all it does is validate my folk psychology, well, sometimes I do have to do that to establish that
Mhm.
this is true.
Yeah,
But in
yeah.
most cases, it's not going to, invoke my imagination.
No, no, exactly. I think it's good to, like I said, to prove the obvious sometimes, because
Sure.
sometimes we think something is true without anybody ever having studied it properly. So it's good to confirm that. But yeah, as soon as you start looking at interactions that are more than one or two obvious steps removed from each other, then it gets interesting.
Very nice. So maybe we could start by talking a bit more about this book.
Sure.
And then I'd love to go to the genitalia stuff,
Uh-huh.
then go to maybe the links between evolution and evolutionary psychology, because it may or may not surprise you, Menno, that there are many evolutionary biologists who suddenly lose their minds if you apply the exact same principles that they used to study the finches or the tits or the whatever, the salamander. If I apply the exact same methodology, exact same epistemology for human behavior, I suddenly become a Nazi. And so we can certainly talk about that. But let's begin with this beauty. Tell us the general premise, and then we can drill down.
Well, the general premise is that we we're often taught to think of today as a world that's in upheaval, a world where biodiversity is disappearing, where natural ecosystems are disappearing, and those things are all true. But at the same time, I think it's very helpful and in a way comforting to realize that we are also witnessing an event in the history of life on Earth that is unprecedented. We see urbanized landscapes appearing at an increasing pace all over the world simultaneously in a remarkably short period of time. And these landscapes, these new environments, have been caused by a single species, namely us. This has never happened before in the history of life on Earth, that a single species is able to engineer ecosystems all over the world simultaneously, which share a lot of characteristics. And like with all major changes in the environment, we see that the rest of the living world is evolving in response to it. So urbanized landscapes, of course, they drive a lot of species to extinction, but they also drive the evolution of a lot of species that do not go extinct, species that adapt to the changes due to either new dangers, new challenges, or new opportunities. And there's a growing and very interesting field of research that has sprung up just in the past 10, 20 years of evolutionary biologists that are beginning to discover the urban environment as a wonderful scientific playground to see rapid evolution happening of birds and fungi and animals, plants and fungi and animals that are all evolving at breakneck speed in response to the changes that we're causing in their environment.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think you have several of those examples where in the same way that Darwin had the Galapagos Islands, whereby the Darwinian finches are evolving different beak structures, as a result of certain selection pressures. Well,
Yeah.
you can take Paris, that has different micro-urban environments, and even though the pigeons or whatever the species was, the mole rat or whatever it was, in New York, within the same city, there are these little urban islands that are akin to the Galapagos, where the singular species becomes multiple uniquely selected species. It's mind-blowing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They're not really species yet, but they are
Right.
differentiating in the same way that Darwin's finches must have started differentiating in the beginning, because they're locked up in the various green islands of this archipelago of city parks, which they're really locked up in, and they're adapting not just because they're isolated, but also because the ecology of all those parks is different. So in Central Park, this is work done in Fordham University in New York
Yeah.
by Jason Munchie-South and his team. They're really discovering that, for example, in Central Park, the mice have evolved a variant of a gene that allows them to deal with an extremely fatty diet,
Yeah.
which is a diet made of junk food. And to them, of course, this is just as unhealthy as it is to us, but they have had 400 mouse generations of time to adapt to it. And you really see that happening in real time in cities.
is there some, I'm almost certain you're going to say yes, and if it's yes, I'd love to hear about it. When you look at various species and their capacity to have rapid evolution, akin to what you're, I mean, yes, the lifespan of the species will affect that. That's why you do Drosophila flies and so on, because you, okay, or bacteria or whatever. But is there a mapping that says, here are the types of species that have this very strong innate ability for plasticity versus these other species that are locked in this kind of fixed traits rigidity that doesn't allow them to do well? And if so, what are some of the things that differentiate those species?
Mm-hmm. It's not easy to answer that question. Indeed, generation time plays a role. Also, if you're talking about plasticity, so then what we see in cities, the species that do well and that often also start evolving as soon as they get into cities, are species from dynamic environments. So from areas that are in nature already quite dynamic and changeable and unpredictable,
Right.
like floodplains, for example, forest edges. Species that live in much more predictable and stable environments probably wouldn't do so well in cities, and also are not the first candidates that you would expect to start evolving. So the whole crow family, for example, are usually, most of those are species that live in those dynamic environments, and those are also the species that do well and that evolve and adapt to cities. Species from sort of originally half open environments, savanna type environments, like the house sparrow, maybe even also the house, the rock pigeon, which is the ancestor of our city pigeon. I think those are all species that are sort of pre-adapted to an environment that is unstable and a bit messy, and they are among the best candidates of urban species to really adapt very quickly and become urban dwellers.
So basically, I mean, if I wanted to do that study, I would quantify the uncertainty or unpredictability of the typical environment in which the species has evolved, give that some number, 0 to 100, and then correlate that with your ability to adapt in rapidly changing urban environments. And I should be able to see exactly the correlation that you spoke about. So, I mean, conceptually, it should be a feasible study to do.
Yeah, and maybe somebody has done it. It's just not on the top of my head, but that certainly is the way you describe it would, for me, also be the first way to start thinking about it. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, let's move. We'll come back to the evolution of genitalia in a second. But why is it, in your view? I mean, I've got my own thoughts on this, but first of all, are you familiar much with the evolutionary psychology literature, or you don't deal with humans at all?
I in my research, I don't deal with humans at all, but especially for the genitalia book, I've been, yeah, there's also a bit of human genitalia biology in there, and I've been dealing with some of the literature on human evolutionary biology, and of course, it's something that I always get questions about. So as a general evolutionary biologist, you're a little bit primed to answer, to at least be able to discuss it with some sensibility. Yes.
And please feel free to answer any way you want. You won't offend me, but are you of the are you part of the taxonomy of evolutionary biologists that is perfectly happy to apply evolutionary biology for every single species except one, called humans? Or even worse, many evolutionary biologists are perfectly happy to apply evolutionary theory to humans as long as it stops at the neck, so that opposable thumbs, oh yeah, sure, we'll use evolutionary theory. The evolution of the respiratory system, oh sure, evolutionary theory, but don't you dare, Nazi, to explain the human mind using evolutionary theory. And there are some very, very well accomplished scientists, evolutionary biologists, who have fallen into this. You probably know, I mean, your book is called Urban Naturalist, so you might know the autobiography of E.O. Wilson called Naturalist, and he faced that kind of nonsense. What are your thoughts?
He did. Yeah. No, I'm also of the opinion that there's no reason to make an exception for Homo sapiens in terms of evolution of behavior or body morphology. I think our behaviors, our minds are just as evolvable as any other species. I think we're quite a special species, but I think we still follow the same rules. I think morality has evolved. I think our social and sexual behavior has evolved and is actually still evolving. It's probably evolving in these urban communities faster than we've ever thought possible.
Right. Do you what's the ecosystem for Darwinian thinking in the Netherlands? You're housed in the Netherlands, correct?
Yeah. Yes.
So the reason why I asked this question, I mean, I haven't done a formal study, but while there is a general reluctance to accept evolutionary thinking for human behavior, certainly in the social sciences, it is improving a bit, but that statement applies more or less somehow in different, ecosystems. So, for example, France, for whatever reason, has not really picked up evolution. There aren't too many evolutionary psychologists in France. I don't know why.
Oh,
Where,
okay.
so what's the general, is Darwinian thinking fertile in the Netherlands, or what's the general story there?
It's fairly fertile, yeah. There's this. I wouldn't be able to distinguish between evolution applied to humans and
Right.
evolution applied in general. I don't have any data on that, but I do know that there's this study worldwide, or at least it's done in many countries, of the acceptance of evolution that's repeated, I think, every 10 years or so.
Oh,
And
yes.
France is actually very high, usually higher than the Netherlands, because we have a small but quite strong religious minority in the Netherlands. So I think we're about 85% at the moment. It might be dropping. I'm not really sure. Japan is I think very high. Turkey and the US are.
I was going to
at the
say that from I
somewhere.
think this is, you're talking about the 2006, either Nature or Science. It's like a 2-page
Yeah,
paper. And I remember that Turkey and the US were the worst on the
like
acceptance.
40% or something. Yeah.
But that's evolution, not evolutionary
It's
psychology.
evolution
But
in general. Yes, yes, yes. So I don't have any data on the acceptance of evolution of evolutionary principles applying to humans just as much as to other animals. I think, the people I talk to, but of course that's not a cross section of the Dutch population. I think they would, they would generally accept. I think like Frans de Waal, of course, is originally a Dutch
of
scientist,
course,
and he's very well known in the Netherlands. And I think a lot of people have picked up, or at least well-read people have picked up on his ideas. So I think the notion that human behavior evolves, I think, is quite well widespread. Um, I would say at least 3/4 of the country, but maybe that's too optimistic.
interesting. Speaking of Frans de Waal, I mean, I'm sure you know, but maybe our viewers don't. He was a very well-known and respected primatologist who just recently passed away, right? Like maybe in the
Yeah,
last
yeah,
month or two. Yeah, one
yeah.
of the great regrets is that I never got a chance to have a chat with him on
Oh,
this
yeah.
show. I did go to, I can't remember which conference it was. It was in the last 10 years. I think he might have been talking about his empathy work.
Hmm.
And he's got a paper in behavioral and brain sciences with Stephanie Preston, I think, looking at the proximate and ultimate explanations for empathy. That's recently
Right.
come back to my mind because my next book is going to be on suicidal empathy,
Okay.
the misapplication and the mistriggering of empathy in the wrong context to the wrong targets, which then results in all sorts of insane public policy decisions, whether it be in immigration or criminality and so on. And so so people should definitely check out his work. Okay, anything else we want to cover on this before we move on to all you want to know about genitalia, but we're afraid to ask?
Let's move to the genitalia. I haven't talked about that book for a while. It's
All right,
already
let's do it. So, I mean,
10 years old.
before I cue you up to take over the floor, one of the classic examples that I discuss certainly in my lectures as relating to one feature of genitalia is the famous study across primates showing that the correlation between testes size and the body size of the male of that species correlates to female promiscuity in that species,
Yeah,
so that
yeah,
the genitalia of males is evolving as a adaptive response to female behavior. Okay, so starting with that, take it away, doctor.
Well, yeah. So the book, the central message of the book, Nature's Nether Regions, is that of all our organs, and with our I mean all animals, not just humans, the things we use for reproduction are evolving the fastest. As you see, I'm interested in fast evolution in cities, but also fast evolution in the nether regions. Genitalia. So if you would compare the shape of the kidneys of a wide range of mammals, they would all look pretty much kidney shaped. But if you see then a graph of all the penises or all the vulvae of those same mammals, they would look wildly different. So evolution in reproductive organs, especially the external ones, is occurring at breakneck speed. And that's also why, because I'm originally a taxonomist, I'm somebody who distinguishes species, describes new species, use genitalia to distinguish species that are otherwise very similar. So I've got a large beetle collection, also a large snail collection. When two species are very similar on the outside, you can't really tell them apart. If you look at their genitalia, usually the male genitalia, sometimes also the female genitalia, you will always see very clear differences. So it's very easy to distinguish species and on the genitalia, and that's because evolution in genitalia is I mean, anything that changes the shape of the genitalia will usually affect reproduction, and reproduction is the currency of evolution. So any change there is going to have an effect, either negative or positively.
And the effect is more direct than other traits that might. Right. Okay.
Yeah. It immediately affects the reproductive output, so it immediately affects evolution. So really, the naughty bits of species is really the arena where you can find lots of interesting evolutionary patterns. So yeah, I really thought, since there wasn't a book for the general public about this pretty attractive, but also very revealing in many meanings of the word, field of study, it was really fun to write an entire book about the evolution of genitalia. And there's a lot of literature, but it's all obscure and it's not really been popularized, and that's what I've tried to do with that book.
Does that mind-blowing original finding that you started with, which I want to repeat just for me to process it, because that definitely fits under the "that's interesting" exclamation point framework. So you look at many species, all these species have common organs. We have eyes, we have kidneys, we have a respiratory system.
Yeah.
Many of those organs will exhibit homologous features, to use fancy biological language, across species, and the ones that exhibit the greatest amount of difference across species are specific to genitalia. Did I summarize that right?
Yeah, it's pretty much like that. Yeah, in most cases.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, even us ourselves and chimpanzees, we when you would ask somebody what's the difference between a chimpanzee and a human, they'll come up with brain size and with the shape of hands and feet, but nobody mentions the fact that the chimpanzee penis is pointed, doesn't have a glans, has a bone inside, has little sharp spines on the outside, that the female vulva swells up, that the clitoris is much larger. So the number of differences between the chimpanzee genitalia and the human genitalia is much larger than almost any other organ you could see. And that's not just subjectively, it's also if you would measure the shape differences. There's simply more going on in the genitalia, and it's happening faster.
Wow. How many species? I mean, we can decide which taxa you want to focus on. It's up to you. But how many don't have a penile bone, as is the case for humans, where it's actually a blood flow hydraulic system? Like, are there many other species that have that, or is it everybody is penile bone with the exception of humans?
No, I think in the mammals, I don't know mammals that well, but there are certain orders and families where you always find penile bones. I think in squirrels, in walruses, and those groups. So it's widespread in various groups, and it has been appearing and disappearing in various groups of mammals as well. There's some literature about why that would be. It's probably has to do with having an erectable penis at the ready without having to wait for a hydraulic response first, and that again depends on the ecology of the species, on how large the groups are, how much competition there is. So that's another thing, that the ecology and the way of life of a species is one of the things that determines what their genitalia will look like. Whether there is a lot of competition among males, or a lot of competition among females, for example. It depends on the density of a species, how rare they are, how easily they find mates, and therefore this whole competition between sexual partners is what drives the evolution. So we don't find this phenomenon among species that only mate once in their life. So it's
Right.
there, the genitalia are always the same, or nearly the same. Termites, for example, these termite queens, they just mate with one male and they are fertilized, and they use that sperm to fertilize all their eggs for the rest of their life. There is no way, or almost no way, for males to compete with each other, or for females to exert a choice between other males. So this pure monogamy creates in the genital region for a very boring landscape.
So that actually segues into another question. So Robert Trivers, the evolutionary biologist, phenomenal guy, although on a personal level, we might discuss whether he's great or not. I've had my little run-ins with him, but truly, I mean, the stuff that he's done has been unbelievable. One of which, and I usually use this example to demonstrate the explanatory power and parsimony of evolutionary theory, right? So parental investment theory basically says you want to understand patterns of sex differences within a species, let alone across species. Simply look at which of the two sexes provides the greater minimal obligatory parental investment, and that's going to have all the downstream effects that you could imagine. And the way you test that is that you take sex role reversal species where you then see the exact opposite patterns. I mean, literally, as if, I mean, you couldn't make up the data to be that perfect. So is there a similar grand theory that one can use to explain the distribution of genitalia forms across taxa?
Well, it's so Bill Eberhard, who is a scientist who has written a lot. He's written a number of landmark publications about the evolution of genitalia. He calls it the three-way tug of war, and this is really what's so. On the one hand, you have females that are, you could say, that have different interests from the males that they mate with, because of course for the males it would be best if a female uses his sperm to fertilize all her eggs and no other male sperm. Evolutionarily, that would serve the male's interest best. But for the female side, it would be best if she has the ultimate choice of which sperm to use from which males to fertilize which eggs with. So that sets up a conflict of interest during copulation, which can drive on the female side structures that would keep the control on her side, and on the male side structures that would override that
morphological structures.
Morphological, but also sometimes chemical structures, hormonal structures, or hormonal. I mean, there are some. Yeah, as a side note. So, for example, the bedbug is a species where the female has all the necessary plumbing to store the sperm of the male and to decide for herself whether she's not going to use it. But at some point during evolution, the male has evolved an ability to override that choice simply by injecting his penis into her body wall, and his sperm will completely ignore all her plumbing. They will just swim right through her body cavity, right through individual cells, even targeting the egg cells. So the female has lost all opportunity to control what happens when she's inseminated. There's also in snails, which are hermaphrodite, which makes it more difficult to think about, but they fertilize each other simultaneously in land snails, and they inject each other with a dart, really a stone dart, which they make out of calcium carbonate, which is laced with hormones which trigger involuntary contractions in the organ that is supposed to absorb the sperm. So it actually, if the dart is injected in the right way in the partner will absorb more sperm than it would otherwise have done. So there the structure is, I mean, the structure is the dart, but there's also the chemical compounds that are injected with the dart. So that's one part of the tug of war, but there's a third leg to the three-way tug of war, and that's the competition between males and other males. So different males want to, quote unquote, because this is all an evolutionary process, of course, there's no actual decision-making process, but different males compete with each other over access to the limited number of eggs that a female can provide. And evolution has caused structures on males' genitalia that do not just bypass, or that do not just target the choice mechanism of females, but they also target the sperm of other males, the mating success of other males. So there are some males which leave behind a plug in the female
Yes.
genitalia, which prevents other males from mating with her. There are some males which scoop out the sperm of previous
Yeah, yeah.
males before they inject their own sperm.
Those are insect species, right?
The plugs are, well, they're spiders, insects, but also us, also primates
Okay.
produce sperm plugs, even though it's not a part of the genitalia. So in spiders, there's actually part of the penis that is left behind. It
Yeah.
breaks off and it's left behind in the female genitalia. But in primates, there are proteins in the semen which coagulate and which produce a strong plug. And in chimpanzees, which, as you mentioned, are highly promiscuous, so their sperm plug is really necessary. This is really a very tough structure that really plugs the female vagina on top of the sperm that has been deposited. So it prevents what is known as sperm dumping by the female. This happens a lot after mating, that the female just ejects all the sperm and withholds a chance for it to fertilize her eggs. So you can, as a male, you can prevent that to some extent by leaving a sperm plug behind.
I'm going to come back to sperm wars in a second, but I just
Mm.
had an idea, which, if it hasn't been tested, I see a collaboration in our future.
Uh-huh.
Is it the case? So, has the distribution of female orgasms been across species been studied? So, question one, is that a yes?
To some extent, yeah. It's not nowhere near complete, but in a lot of mammals it has been recorded. Yes.
Okay, so then here is a hypothesis that I'm going to propose, and I'm sure you're going to tell me, sorry, you're 30 years too late, but let me take a shot. I would posit that the likelihood or the incidence of females having orgasms has to correlate with the extent to which the species is biparental. Because I'm thinking that one of the ways that I establish, I male, that I'm worthy for you to keep me around is that if I am attentive enough to your sexual needs, that I will work hard enough to not just care about my needs. And that is part of a package of the fact that we need to bond long enough as a biparental species. Am I onto something or am I totally off?
Um, it might play a role, but I think all the evidence that I've seen so far points to a more mechanical role for a female orgasm, whereby vacuum is produced, which makes the uterus absorb more sperm than if there wouldn't be a female orgasm. So there's actually, it's called the upsuck theory,
Yeah,
which,
yes, of course.
yeah.
Go ahead.
So um, so in a sense, so the both things could be at play. That indeed it would, if a male invests a lot in raising the offspring, then it would also be beneficial for him to make sure that his sperm is being absorbed and therefore that the female has an orgasm. Although I think that would also be true if the male wouldn't be investing a lot of effort in the offspring, but then the
The
loss would be
upsuction
less.
is true, even if he's not investing, you're saying.
Yeah,
Yeah, great.
But
But
it's still something we could collaborate on,
all
definitely.
right, that's very exciting. Okay, so back to sperm whore. Are you familiar with Robin Baker's work?
Yeah.
So I actually, so I've talked about, I've even written about some of his work, and when I lecture about it in class, the students, you have to see their faces, it's unbelievable. Now,
Yeah.
of course, there have been others who've come back and said, no, it's complete BS. I actually wrote to him and said, hey, please come on my show, and he wrote back very, very nicely, very politely, said, oh, I'm kind of retired now, so I'm out. And then I asked him, I said, so what's the bottom line? Is your research been validated and we can move on or not? And, of course, maybe because it's his research, he said that the detractors are not nearly as, strong in their detraction as otherwise. So, but before I ask you to answer, let me just summarize what the research says. It's basically the idea that there are three types of phenotypes that come in spermatozoa, human spermatozoa. There is the standard one that we think of, which is kind of the fertilizer. It's the guys running with the long tails looking for the egg. But he argues that there are all other types of phenotypes for the spermatozoa, the blockers and the killers. The blockers are looking to block entry of incoming sperm, which of course suggests that our female ancestors would have been quite promiscuous since sperm is viable for about 72 hours in the female reproductive tract. The killers don't care about the egg, are going to try to kill other men. So today, based on what you know, where are we in this? Is there greater support for all his stuff? Is there lesser? Where are we in the story?
For humans and for that specific aspect of what he did, I'm not sure. I know that in other species, in mollusks, there's definitely multiple types of sperm, and some of those are blockers and killers. If it's been upheld for humans, I don't know. I'm not even sure if he had very firm evidence for that particular statement, but the work that he did, which I find even more interesting, is the study in which he also investigated whether or not women after having intercourse would dump most of the semen that they had received or not, and how that involved how they rated the male that they had sex with, and also whether or not they had an orgasm during sex. And that was really a very courageous experiment, which involved a lot of colleagues and students and condoms, and which had been donated and returned anonymously. And it's really, I think he really did a good job in at least setting the stage for doing that sort of work on human sexual behavior with a very hard biological core in it. He actually, I once organized a symposium here in the Netherlands, that's almost 30 years ago now, in which he was one of the invitees.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I had spent a few days together with him, and he was, of course, after this scientific work, he did write more fanciful books in which the science and fiction was sort of mixed. It wasn't really clear which parts were substantiated and which were just fancy. But and I think he's been criticized for that by Richard Dawkins among others.
Right.
But
Maybe
he certainly was,
Tim
I think, a
Burkhead,
very.
maybe?
Oh yes, you're right. Yes, it was Tim Burkhead. Yeah,
Yes.
yes. But I think he definitely did a couple of very interesting and very courageous experiments.
Yeah, one more thing about sperm, and then we can move on as we approach the hour. I talk about again in some of my lectures and in one of my previous books, the study that has looked at uh, so uh, polygamy is simply one to many. Polygyny, I mean, you may know this, but some of our viewers may not. Usually people use the term polygamy to imply one man with multiple women, whereas really polygamy just means one with many. Polygyny is one man, multiple women. Polyandry is one woman, multiple men. And so a British researcher had actually done a content analysis of porn movies. Uh, and you would think, oh, the fantasy of men is, to have a harem of women, and therefore porn content should be a lot more, one man having sex with multiple women, whereas it turns out actually there's a lot more polyandrous situations, one woman with multiple men. And so then the question is that triggers a visual trigger for sperm competition. It literally, quote, gets the rise out of you. Now, some other researchers came along to test this at the, at the physiological level, if you'd like, or the chemical level, or the sperm level, where I don't know if you know the study, where they asked men to take one of two images, either a polyandrous one or not a polyandrous one, and then return their sample. And do you know which study I'm talking about? Do you know this?
I don't think so. No, no.
Okay, so get ready to experience a "that's interesting" exclamation point moment. And it turns out that the samples returned from the polyandrous images had sperm with greater motility, supporting the idea that it is because of sperm competition. So, for example, in animal husbandry, when you want your stud to be inspired, you actually show him, like, he has to see some other mating happening, and then that will kind of get him in the mood. And so that to me seems unbelievable, no?
It is, but the work that has been done on the evolution of human genitalia, they tend to support the fact that there must have been periods in human evolution where multiple mating in very short periods of time must have taken place. There's some evidence that the edge around the human glands, which is also quite unique among primates, that's actually a device to remove sperm from previous males. We know that it works. There's been a very nice study with dildos and fake vaginas and fake sperm done by experimenters. And I'm always wondering how they managed to claim that from their financial department. But in any case, it showed that it's that shape could, in theory, have evolved to remove sperm from competitors.
But I mean, that certainly applies to the mushroom shape of the human penis. I mean, isn't that the argument for why it is shaped that way?
Well, that's the argument in this case. Yeah, but it only works, of course, if the chance of meeting a competitor's sperm in your mate's vagina is high enough.
Yeah, exactly. What are your thoughts? I mean, I suspect you don't, what I'm about to ask you, you don't see as much because you're dealing with animals other than Homo sapiens. But why do you think it is so difficult for most people to accept evolution in general and evolutionary psychology in particular? It's as if, and I've actually argued this in some of my writings, that it's as if we have evolved to have obstacles against evolutionary thinking for a wide variety of reasons. Does that make sense to
you? It does. Of course, it is. I think we have trouble imagining the vast amount of time that is needed for evolutionary change. We're not used to thinking about the accumulating effects of so many generations. We think of cause and effect on much smaller time scales. So it's very hard to imagine the power of evolution when time is involved and when time is limitless. So I think that is one obstacle for us. And also in our day-to-day life, we see different behaviors which we can explain in a proximate way.
Yes.
Much more easily than in an ultimate way. Because, the ultimate way is the way our brains are wired and the variety among them in different individuals. And that is the result of evolution and genetic variation over a much longer time period. And we're not used to seeing that as one of the reasons why people do what they do.
And I think, so for the reasons that you've said and a few others, it gives the false illusion to most people that it is the case that because the ultimate explanation, so for those of us who don't know what that means, that's the Darwinian why did it evolve to be like this? It feels as though it's post hoc speculation, right? It feels as though You sit with a cognac, with a nice cigar, and you just pontificate about just so stories void of evidence. Whereas, as I've repeatedly explained with great frustration, that the evidentiary threshold that is baked into evolutionary theory is typically higher than is expected in other sciences, but yet we're accused of the exact opposite. We don't adhere to evidence, we just pontificate and tell cute stories at parties.
Yeah, that
Could we
also
ever get
happens.
over this?
Yeah. Well, of course, there is a lot of vacuous speculation going on at parties, which is dressed up as evolutionary psychology, and that doesn't help, of course. So,
Yes.
but it is good, I think, always to point people to the evidence and to the publications that show this sort of thing, much more clearly than people think it's proven.
Okay, last question, since we're approaching 1 hour. Please tell us a bit about your next book, Urban Naturalist, and any other projects that you'd like to use this opportunity to promote. Take it away, Menno.
Thank you. Yeah, well, Urban Naturalist is it's in a way it's a book that continues where Darwin Comes to Town left off, and there is a bit of urban evolution, some new work in the book, but it's much more. The original title for it was How to Be an Urban Naturalist, and we decided not to use. It's going to be published by MIT Press, and the editors and me decided not to use that title because it could give the impression that it's a simple manual, a step-to-step guide on how to become an urban naturalist, whereas it's much more about what it is like to be a naturalist, an old-fashioned, exploratory, inquisitive, curious naturalist of the Victorian style in a modern setting, in today's world, where the most fascinating kind of biology is happening in the urban realm, where you could be a Victorian explorer in your own streets, discovering completely new stuff, new behaviors, new natural history, new evolution that hasn't been documented before. And the nice thing is that in a way, science has come full circle. I'm trying to advocate if people start doing what I'm describing in the book, then science has come full circle in the sense that in the 19th century, in the early 19th century, there was no such thing as a professional scientist. The scientists were people who had, for some reason or other, time and curiosity to be independent explorers of their environment, and they were publishing and reading their papers to their like-minded friends. They didn't need much to do interesting discoveries. Darwin just had his greenhouse and his wormstone in his garden, and that's where he did his work. But then came the 20th century, and that sort of individualistic discovery was no longer possible. You needed large institutes, a lot of money, large libraries, large labs full of equipment. So the amateur was sort of cut out of the scientific world for most of the 20th century. They were dabbling in the fringe, but they were not making important discoveries. And I think now the time has come for non-professional scientists to start making interesting discoveries again, because you don't need those large labs. You don't need large libraries. Everything is available for you. You can buy cheap equipment online. You can turn your phone into a mini scientific lab. All the PDFs of scientific publications are downloadable either legally or semi-legally online. And there are massive open online courses, the so-called MOOCs. I've also designed one on evolution, which has thousands, tens of thousands of students, larger numbers than I would ever have reached in my university classes. So everybody can benefit from university level scientific training. And I think to be an explorer of your urban world really helps you to find new value in living in an urbanized world, because most of today's people, and later in the century it will be an even larger fraction, will be living in large urbanized conglomerations and never have access to wild nature anymore. So if they want to be a naturalist, they can become a naturalist in their own street, in their own neighborhood, team up with neighbors who are also interested in science and in flora and fauna, and really create new value for living in an urban environment which most people think as completely devoid of nature. But I think it's really the other way around, and you can really enjoy the same pleasures that those early Victorian explorers did in today's modern cities.
Well, I love it. I can't wait. That's coming out 2025, right?
Yeah, 1st of April, probably.
Okay, so make sure to have your publisher send me a copy and we'll have you back
I
to
will.
discuss Urban Nationalist. Such a pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much for coming on. Stay on the line so we could say goodbye offline. Real pleasure to meet you. Thank you, Menno.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Cheers.